Hi, everybody. This is Mrs. G's Story Time, and we are reading Tanglewoods Secret by Patricia Sanjan by permission of Moody Publishing Company. And we are on Chapter 10, My Sheep Hear My Voice. I caught a bad cold from sleeping in the church, and we had to go to bed for 3 days. Peter stayed with me most of the time, so we put in a lot of work on the bird hook. When we were tired of drawing and writing, we lay and talked. He was never tired of hearing about my night in the church, and I was quite pleased and surprised to hear how much everybody had missed me. I don't think Auntie or Uncle went to bed all night, Philip told me. I couldn't go to sleep either. I thought you might be dead, and I was crying and crying in bed. And then I went downstairs, and I found Auntie crying a little bit in the kitchen. We had a lovely drink of hot chocolate together, and she gave me a chocolate biscuit, and we sat by the fire and talked. What did you talk about? I asked, hoping it was about me. Oh, lots of things, answered my brother cheerfully. I said perhaps you had been drowned in the Whippet Brook. Auntie said she thought you were probably just hiding and she might send you to boarding school as a punishment. And I said I thought it was a jolly bad idea. Why? I asked hopefully. Because I shouldn't have anyone to play with on Saturday, he explained. I said I thought it wouldn't be any use because you would run away at once. But what did she say then? She said you wouldn't be able to. So I said it would be a pity to send you to boarding school in any case because I should probably have a nervous breakdown. Whatever is that? I asked with great interest. Oh, it's an illness you get when people do things you don't like. I heard Auntie talking about someone who had a nervous breakdown because the cook went away. So I said I would have one if you went away. Like measles? I asked. Measles was the only illness I'd ever had, and I thought it was very important. Oh, I don't know, Philip. I don't think it has spots, but it doesn't matter anyway. You're not going now. But you'll have to be very careful about being good, because once she's thought of it, she may think of it again. I was silent. I didn't tell anybody yet about what happened in the woods, but somehow I did not know how to put it into words. How could I make Philip believe that something had really happened? There was nothing to show for it, and sometimes lying there with a sore throat and blocked-up nose, I began to wonder how much of it was true or whether perhaps I had imagined it. And then I would take out my precious picture and look at it until I was sure again. I would bury my face in the pillow and ask the Good Shepherd to let me feel close to him again, as I had felt that morning when we had walked home. There was my Bible, too. As soon as I got home, I found it in the drawer and started to read it. After much searching, I found the chapter Mr. Tandy had read to me about the sheep that was lost. I read it to myself again and again until I almost knew it by heart. I read the rest of the chapter, too, about the boy who ran away just like me and who came home again, and he said he was sorry and was forgiven by his father. I thought it was exactly like me and Aunt Margaret. I liked it very much indeed. I tried to pray, too, and I had been taught to say my prayers, but somehow it was different now. Before it was just saying words because I thought I should, but now it was talking to someone I knew and who loved me. It was on my second night in bed that I made a great discovery. Philip had gone down to supper, and I'd pulled out my Bible from under my pillow, for I was rather shy about letting anyone see me read it. As I turned the pages of the Gospel looking for the stories, I came across the 10th chapter of St. John's Gospel, and the word shepherd caught my eye at once. I had often heard the chapter read in church and at school, but I had forgotten where in the Bible it came. And then I read it with great excitement. Here it was, all over again. I'm the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd gives his life for the sheep. I did not understand the verses about the thieves and the robbers, but I understood about the sheep following. That meant being good and doing what the shepherd said. But what could it mean about hearing the shepherd's voice? The clergyman had said that Jesus would speak to me and that I must obey, but although I had laid in bed with my eyes shut, listening hard, I could hear nothing. How could I know his voice if he never spoke to me? This question troubled me quite a lot that night and the next day until suddenly I had a good idea. I would go and see Mr. Tandy, take him my postcard and tell him about what had happened. Perhaps he would be able to tell me about the shepherd's voice. I was very impatient to get about this, and it was allowed to go down to the tea on the 4th day. It was a happy meal, and I went to bed thinking, after all, it was much nicer being good. Being naughty was not really worth it. Luckily, the next day was sunny, and after dinner I set off joyfully across the fields with Philip. It was a special afternoon because had not been out for 4 whole days, and also it rather felt precious because the end of the holidays was so near. We had a wonderful afternoon playing with the baby squirrel that Philip found in the oak tree. And suddenly I thought of something. "Philip," I said, "I'm going home now. You see, I'm especially want to visit somebody on the way back." "All right," answered Philip happily. "We'll go. Who do you want to visit?" "Mr. Tandy, the shepherd," I replied. "Good," agreed Philip. "I like Mr. Tandy. I'll come with you." I stopped suddenly, wondering how I could explain. Philip just walked on, watching the magpie. "Philip," I said slowly, "you can't come with me. You see, it's a secret, and I want to see Mr. Tandy alone. It's something you don't know about, and I've got to go by myself." It was Philip's turn to stop and stare. He turned right around and looked at me as he thought he had heard something wrong. "But why?" he asked at last. "You always tell me your secrets. I always tell you mine. You shouldn't tell Mr. Tandy before me. I'm your brother, and he's only an old man." I could see he was upset, and I felt dreadful. There was a long pause, and I didn't know what to say. "Oh, all right," he said at last, trying to speak as though he didn't care. "I'll go home, and you'll find me in the orchard when you come." He turned and went on. But I followed rather miserably. We walked in single file in silence as far as the stile, where the path split into two. One way led over the meadow towards home, and one led up to the sheepfolds. "Goodbye," said Philip, without looking around. "See you later." He walked slowly across the field with his hands in his pockets. He must have been very miserable indeed, for he was not even watching the sky for birds. As I stood staring at his lonely little figure, I saw all in a flash, perhaps for the first time, what sort of brother Philip had been to me. I remembered how seriously he had listened when I talked to him, and how patiently he had joined in with my make-believe stories with my dolls, how quickly he would run back from school in case I should be missing him, and how faithfully he had stood by me when I was cross and bad-tempered and punished. As I thought of all these things, I suddenly didn't want to have any secret at all that I could not share with Philip. Of course I wanted to go on belonging to the Good Shepherd, but not by myself. Philip must belong too, and then we could enjoy the secret together. I ran down the hill as fast as my legs could carry me, shouting his name at the top of my voice. He turned around and waited for me, and even as I ran, I could not help thinking how much nicer he was than me. I would have walked off in a bad mood and pretended not to hear. I was quite out of breath when I reached him and sort of fell against him to stop myself. "Philip," I gasped, "I didn't mean it at all. I don't want to have secrets without you, and I'll tell you everything always. Only, you see, there's a bit I don't understand, and I can't tell you properly until I've asked Mr. Tandy. But then I shall know all about it, and I'll tell you in the wigwam tomorrow, and you can have it too." The shadow passed at once from Philip's eyes, and his smile shone out again. "It's all right," he assured me. "I don't mind you going to tell Mr. Tandy, as long as you tell me afterwards. But it will spoil everything if we don't tell each other our secrets." I was so pleased to see him happy again that I flung my arms around his neck and kissed him. I had not done such a thing for a long time. He looked a bit breathless and astonished and glanced around the field to see that nobody was looking. I turned and ran back up the hill, but when he had gone halfway up, I turned to look at Philip. He had his head thrown far back watching the birds. He had forgotten all about the quarrel. I was very red in the face when I reached the sheepfolds because I had climbed the hill so fast. To my great relief, Mr. Tandy was there mending the gate, and I ran straight over to him. "Mr. Tandy," I said at once, "I've got to tell you something. I found out all about the story you read me, and I know that it means me, and that the Good Shepherd means Jesus." He stood there with his hammer in his hand, looking down at me with a look of real joy on his face. "I'm really glad to hear it, little mate," he said. "Maybe you'll tell me a bit more about it." "Oh, yes," I replied, pulling him down beside me on the seat. I was so pleased to find someone who would believe me that I forgot to be shy. I told him everything, about running away and Mr. Robinson and the picture and me belonging to the shepherd. Mr. Tandy listened carefully, and his wrinkled old face was bright with happiness. "Thank you for that, Ruth," he replied. "For if you belong to him now, you'll belong to him forever. No one can take you away from him." "Mr. Tandy," I asked, "are you one of his sheep?" "Sure," he answered. "I've been one of his sheep for almost 50 years. Then, Mr. Tandy," I went on eagerly, "have you ever heard his voice? I say his sheep, it says his sheep hear his voice. But I've listened and he never says anything to me, and I do want to hear him so badly." He thought for a long time before answering that question, and then he spoke very slowly. "I'm going to call my sheep, Ruth," he said. "When I call, take a look at all of them. Especially notice those over by the hedge and see the difference." I watched and fascinated while he gave a low, clear call. Every sheep in the meadow lifted its head and came a step or two nearer, except for the group by the hedge. They went on feeding quietly as though nothing had happened. "Why don't they answer?" I asked. "Can't they hear you?" "They can hear me well enough," answered the old man, "but they don't know my voice from all the others, because they belong to another shepherd who has been taken ill. They only joined my flock 2 days ago. But let them walk to the pastures with me for a week or two, and let them put them in my fold and put my hands on their heads and feed them. They'll soon come to know my voice the same as the rest. Now, there are many voices speaking to your heart, Ruth, and you've only belonged to the shepherd for a few days. So maybe you haven't learned to pick out his voice from all the others, but it's only a still, small voice." "Tell me how I can start," I begged. "Well, it's like this," he said at last, after another long pause. "Do you ever want to be a bad little girl?" "Oh, yes, often," I replied. "Before I ran away, I used to lose my temper and be rude to Aunt Margaret nearly every day. But then," went on Mr. Tandy, "you listen to this. Next time you want to lose your temper, you remember there are 2 voices speaking to you. There's the voice of the enemy telling you to kick up a row and stamp your feet and all of the rest. But if you hold back a minute and listen, maybe you'll hear another voice, a little quiet-like voice, telling you to be gentle and to do as you're told. And that's the voice of the shepherd. If you learn to take notice of that voice, he'll speak again, and you'll find you're hearing him all the time and everywhere. He talks to me out in these fields, and when I read my Bible, he comes to me, and I know it isn't just a book of black and white print for clever people, but it's the voice of my shepherd speaking to me." Drawn by his gentle voice, the sheep had come quite close and were standing near his knees, their gentle faces turned up towards him. When he stopped talking, they moved away, cropping the grass. I got to my feet, held out my hand. "Thank you very much, Mr. Tandy," I said. "I'm going home now to listen, and I hope I shall soon want to get into a temper." He shook his head. "Don't you wish any such thing," he warned me, "and don't you try it alone. Remember, it's only the Good Shepherd who can stop you from doing wrong." Philip was not in the orchard, so I went to look for him indoors. Rather to my dismay, I heard voices in the dining room. They had already started tea, and I was late. We were not allowed to be late for tea, so I stepped into the room rather guiltily and made for my seat with a worried glance at Aunt Margaret. She was looking extremely cross. "Ruth," she said sharply, "you're late again, and I'm not going to have it. Sit down and eat your tea in silence, and you're not going to have a chocolate biscuit." Now, this was a dreadful punishment, because I love chocolate biscuits, and we hardly ever had them. I gave a stomp with my foot and threw back my head. All my happiness disappeared, and a great rush of angry words seemed to come springing out of my heart, all ready to tumble out of my mouth. In fact, I had actually opened my mouth when I suddenly remembered. If I got into a rage now, I wouldn't be able to listen to the little quiet voice of the Good Shepherd. And if I didn't listen, perhaps he wouldn't speak to me again. It was so difficult to stop those angry words coming out that I had to clap my hands over my mouth to keep them in. So I stood in the middle of the room, listening while my Aunt Philip stared at me with the greatest surprise. "What is the matter?" asked my aunt coldly. "Have you bitten your tongue?" Following the shepherd meant being like him. If I'm going to be like him, I must stop stomping, shouting, and answering back and sulking, because Jesus had never done any of these things. "Help me to follow you," I whispered in my heart. "Stop me from being angry, quick." I drew a great big breath and put my hand back in my pocket. Then I sat down in my chair without saying anything, for my anger was all going away. Auntie still continued to stare at me, but I went on munching my bread and butter in silence, and I did not look at the chocolate biscuits because I was afraid the sight of them might make me angry again. We were all very quiet for the rest of the tea, and when it was finished, Aunt Margaret said that as it was my first day up after my cold, I had better go straight to bed. I did not mind at all, for I had a lot to think about what I wanted to be alone. I lay in bed with my arms thrown above my head on the pillow, looking at the stars and listening to the birds twittering until I fell asleep. I was perfectly happy because 2 wonderful things had happened that day for the first time. I heard the voice of the Good Shepherd, and I kept my temper. Tomorrow it will be Chapter 11, The Accident. I love you. I'm praying for you all. Bye-bye.